The screams, the explosions, the rising fire, it all began in a place no one expected. A quiet Sunday morning in paradise turned into hell. Before the first bullet was fired, before the skies filled with smoke, the Pacific was silent. But beneath that silence, tension was building. An ocean caught between two powers racing toward an unavoidable storm. The Empire of Japan, proud, disciplined, determined to expand its reach. The United States, confident, industrial, unprepared for what was coming. In the morning hours of December 7th, 1941, history shattered that silence at Pearl Harbor. In one instant, the Pacific ignited. This wasn't just a battle. It was the beginning of a war that would shape the fate of nations. And from that moment, no one would be untouched by the fire. For decades, Japan's empire had grown across Asia. In Tokyo, military planners turned their eyes toward the Pacific, seeking more land, more resources. The United States, across the ocean, was hesitant to get involved. Trade, diplomacy, and politics had been their shield, until it wasn't enough. Japan's ambition wasn't just about expansion, it was survival. The country's resources were dwindling, and they were desperate. Yet, in Washington, the decision to confront Japan was delayed, weighed down by the fog of political and economic strategy. The storm brewed, but no one was ready for the thunder to come. Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941. A quiet day in Honolulu. Families and sailors went about their routine, unaware of the incoming storm. In the sky above, hundreds of Japanese aircraft soared toward the harbor, hidden by the clouds, their engines roaring like thunder. In the span of 2 hours, Pearl Harbor was transformed from a peaceful port into an inferno. Battleships moored in rows became twisted wrecks. Rising smoke darkened the sky. The United States was not only attacked, but struck in a way that humiliated a nation's pride. The Navy was crippled. Thousands of lives were lost. But America, as it always does, would rise again. This time, it would be for something far greater than a battle. It would be for survival. And the Pacific, once a silent witness, was now a theater of war. Across the United States, shock turned to resolve. A date which will live in infamy. President Roosevelt's voice filled living rooms nationwide. The sound of radio broadcasts spread across the country, urging enlistment and sacrifice. Men of all ages lined up to join the military. Factories and shipyards were turned into engines of war. Women worked on assembly lines, welding and riveting, helping to build the planes that would soon fill the skies over the Pacific. America was no longer passive. The nation was now part of a global fight for survival, and every man and woman would play a role. The battle had come to them, but the response was clear. They would meet it head-on. The war was no longer distant. It was here, in the Pacific. Japan's empire stretched across islands, the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Their goal was to cut off America's supply lines and secure their dominance in the Pacific. But what Japan didn't account for was the sheer resilience of the American spirit. Across the Pacific, the United States rebuilt quickly. New aircraft carriers were launched, pilots trained, and naval fleets assembled. The Pacific, once an ocean of trade and travel, had now become an ocean of blood, courage, and survival. From the sunlit beaches of Hawaii to the thick jungles of Guadalcanal, men prepared to face not only their enemies, but the unforgiving nature of the Pacific itself. Both sides would be tested, not only in strength, but in endurance, in courage, and in the will to survive. June 4th, 1942. The tide of war had yet to turn. Japan's fleet was formidable, its victory streak unbroken. Midway Atoll, a small, desolate island in the vast Pacific, became the focal point of a battle that would shift the balance of power. American codebreakers, working in secrecy, had deciphered Japan's plans. The element of surprise, once the advantage of Japan, now lay in America's hands. In a desperate clash of aircraft and ships, Japan's fleet lost 4 of its finest carriers. For the first time, Japan had tasted defeat. The Pacific was no longer one-sided. The momentum was shifting. After Midway, the United States pushed forward, but it wasn't easy. The Pacific Islands, with their dense jungles and oppressive humidity, became hellish battlegrounds. Guadalcanal, the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific, became a symbol of both sacrifice and tenacity. Men fought not only the enemy, but the unforgiving landscape. The thick jungle, malaria-infested swamps, and the relentless rain turned the island into a nightmare. Yet, despite the odds, the U.S. Marines held their ground, driven by the belief that this was the key to the Pacific. The battle raged on for 6 months, costing thousands of lives on both sides. But the victory at Guadalcanal marked a turning point in the Pacific theater. Island after island, the United States advanced, pushing through Japanese-held territories in a strategy known as island hopping. The goal was simple: take the strategic islands, bypass the heavily fortified ones, and advance closer to Japan's doorstep. But every island claimed its toll. From Tarawa to Saipan, each battle was a fierce struggle for survival. The U.S. Marines, now seasoned veterans, became increasingly skilled in amphibious warfare. The Japanese forces, outnumbered and cut off from reinforcements, fought fiercely. But the Americans were relentless. With every victory, the United States came closer to Japan's heart. As the United States moved closer to Japan, the Japanese military resorted to increasingly desperate tactics. The kamikaze, divine wind, was born out of desperation. Young pilots, often no older than 18, flew their planes directly into Allied ships, sacrificing themselves for the Empire. The Japanese High Command believed that these suicide attacks could turn the tide of war. For the Americans, the kamikaze were terrifying, unpredictable, and relentless. Yet, despite the high casualties and damage, these attacks could not break the American resolve. The war was nearing its final chapter, and the cost of victory was mounting. February 1945. The battle for Iwo Jima was one of the bloodiest in history. The small island was crucial for the United States, as it would serve as a staging ground for the final assault on Japan's mainland. The Japanese, knowing they could not afford to lose it, dug in deep. Thousands of troops, hidden in tunnels and bunkers, were prepared for a fight to the death. The Marines, once again, faced brutal conditions. The island's volcanic ash made the ground almost impassable, and Japanese artillery constantly rained down on them. After days of fighting, the Marines finally reached the summit of Mount Suribachi. The iconic flag raising would become a symbol of hope, but the battle raged on for weeks, leaving thousands dead on both sides. The Battle of Okinawa marked the final major assault in the Pacific before Japan's doorstep. The Japanese were determined to fight to the last man. The battle was long, brutal, and filled with human suffering. Over 200,000 people died in the struggle, civilians, soldiers, and anyone caught in the crossfire. Okinawa's significance was not just its proximity to Japan, but its role in preparing the U.S. for the final strike on the Japanese mainland. The Japanese Imperial Army fought to the bitter end, but the island eventually fell to American forces. Yet, the cost was immense. Both sides knew this was not a battle won without great sacrifice. The Battle of Okinawa had been one of the most brutal and devastating encounters in the Pacific. The island, strategically located just 350 miles from Japan, was the last major obstacle before the final invasion of the Japanese homeland. The U.S. military, now exhausted after nearly 3 months of combat, faced fierce resistance. The Japanese Imperial Army, knowing that the fall of Okinawa would open the door to Japan itself, fought with desperation. Kamikaze pilots, once viewed as a terrifying spectacle, now became the last line of defense. They threw themselves at U.S. ships in suicidal attacks, knowing their nation's survival was on the line. The Allied forces suffered heavy losses. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians were killed, while U.S. casualties exceeded 12,000. For many soldiers, the gruesome images of Okinawa would remain with them long after the war ended. The battle for Okinawa, while a victory for the Allies, revealed the true cost of war. The island was littered with craters, the ground churned up by endless artillery. Soldiers and civilians alike had endured unimaginable hardships. Many Americans were left questioning, what would the invasion of Japan's homeland be like? The U.S. military estimated that the invasion of Japan would cost millions of lives on both sides. Japan's commitment to fight until the very end meant that every inch of their homeland would be contested. As the soldiers returned to their camps, their thoughts turned to the inevitable next step, the final battle. The last push for Japan would come soon. The war was far from over, but with Okinawa behind them, the Allies were now closer to Japan than ever before. By early August 1945, the United States had a powerful new weapon, the atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project, a secretive government initiative, had succeeded in creating an explosive device of unprecedented power. President Truman faced an agonizing decision. Should the bomb be dropped on Japan? The country had already suffered tremendous loss, but Japan's leadership was still resolute in their refusal to surrender. As the U.S. prepared for a full-scale invasion of Japan, Truman was confronted with the unimaginable choice of whether to use a weapon that could end the war, but at an unimaginable cost. Hiroshima, a city of strategic importance, was selected as the target. On August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped. The explosion obliterated much of the city, killing tens of thousands instantly. But the devastation didn't end there. The radiation would claim even more lives in the days, weeks, and years to come. With the capture of Okinawa, the United States was now within reach of Japan's heart. The final battle for Japan would not take place on the ground. It would come from the skies. American bombers began carrying out raids on Japanese cities, and the devastation was immense. But Japan's leadership still refused to surrender. The United States had one last weapon, the atomic bomb. The decision to use it would change the world forever. The United States was prepared to end the war by any means necessary. And on August 6, 1945, the world witnessed the first atomic explosion used in war. 3 days after Hiroshima, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. While Hiroshima had been the first target, Nagasaki, with its steep hills and narrow valleys, was a more difficult target. But the result was the same: an entire city destroyed, and a civilian population decimated. In the wake of the bombings, Japan was in shock. The country's infrastructure was shattered, its cities reduced to rubble. The Japanese leadership, once unwavering in their resolve, now faced the grim reality that continued resistance would result in further destruction. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender. The war was over. But for the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the end of the war marked the beginning of a long journey to recovery. The physical and emotional scars would last for generations. With the Japanese surrender, the Second World War was officially over. The atomic bombings had marked the end of a conflict that had torn the world apart. But the victory came with a heavy price. The death toll was staggering. Millions of soldiers and civilians had lost their lives. But for those who survived, the war's end brought both relief and confusion. How could a world that had endured such suffering rebuild? The Allies worked quickly to establish peace, but it was clear that nothing would ever be the same. The use of atomic weapons had altered the global balance of power forever. In Europe, the war had ended earlier, but for Japan, the devastation brought on by the bombs meant that they would be rebuilt, not by force, but by compassion. The United States helped Japan reconstruct its cities and its economy, and slowly the country began to recover. But the moral questions of the atomic bomb and the choices made in those final days of war would linger long after the dust had settled. The Pacific had fallen silent once more. The echoes of war drifted over empty seas and broken cities. After years of unimaginable struggle, the Empire of Japan had surrendered. The United States stood victorious, but the cost was beyond measure. Millions of lives were lost. Entire generations were marked by the memories of fire, hunger, and courage. On the islands where battles once raged, quiet waves now touched the shore, washing over the remains of history. Yet from those ashes, the world began to rebuild. Soldiers returned home with stories that few could fully understand. Nations once divided by hate began to speak of peace, technology, and progress. The Pacific War left a scar, but it also lit a warning, a reminder of what happens when ambition turns into destruction. Every monument, every photograph, every story told today carries that echo. And so, the silence that returns to the Pacific is not the same silence as before. It's a silence of reflection, born from loss, strengthened by hope, and destined to remind future generations that peace, once lost, must always be protected.